NHL by the Era, Dynasties and Fall of the Iron Curtain. In this episode of NHL by the Eras, I talk about the dynasties of the 1980s into the early 1990s, as well as the fall of the Iron Curtain and how it impacted the NHL. Although the league expanded from 6 teams to 21 teams, dynasties still prevailed in the 1980s. From 1980 to 1984, the New York Islanders won 4 consecutive Stanley Cups, led by a slew of Hall of Famers including Mike Bossy, Dennis Potvin, Ryan Trottier, and Billy Smith. The Islanders were dominant during this period of time. In 1981, Mike Bossy became the first player to score 50 goals in 50 games since Maurice Richard accomplished the feat in 1945. Wayne Gretzky scored 137 points in the 1979-80 season to win his first of 9 Hart trophies as the NHL's most valuable player. Over the next several seasons, Gretzky established new highs in goals in the season with 92 in the 1981-82 season, assists with 163 in the 1985-86 season, and total points with 215 during the 1985-86 season. Gretzky also set a record for scoring 50 goals in the fewest games, achieving the mark in 39 games. The Islanders and Oilers met in the finals in 1983 as New York swept Edmonton for the last Stanley Cup. The following season in 1984, when the Oilers and Islanders met again in the playoffs, the Oilers won the rematch in 5 games, marking the start of another dynasty. From 1984 to 1990, the Edmonton Oilers won 5 Stanley Cup championships, led by Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier, along with Hall of Famers Jari Kurri, Paul Coffey, Glenn Anderson, and Grant Fuhr. The Oilers were a juggernaut during this period of time. On August 9, 1988, Oilers owner Peter Pocklington, who was in financial trouble, traded Wayne Gretzky to the LA Kings. The Gretzky trade to the LA Kings popularized ice hockey in the United States, but in Canada, it is remembered as the worst trade of all time. With the Edmonton Oilers dynasty gone, Mario Lemieux alongside a young Jaromir Jagr led the Pittsburgh Penguins to Stanley Cups in 1990, 91, and 1991-92. Mario Lemieux, as a gifted forward, won 6 Art Ross trophies as the league's leading scorer and is recognized as arguably the most talented player of all time. In 1988-89, he scored 199 points, becoming the second highest single-season point scorer in history behind Gretzky. While the NHL enjoyed prosperity during the Gretzky years, the fall of the Iron Curtain opened up the game to a much broader and international audience. The NHL first became involved in international play in the mid-1970s, starting with the Summit Series in 1972, which pitted the top Canadian players of the NHL against the top Soviet players. With the 8-game series tied at 3 apiece and a tie, Paul Henderson scooped up a rebound and put it past Soviet goalie Vladislav Tretiak with 34 seconds left in the 8th and final game to score the series-winning goal. In the late 1970s, European players slowly started to join the NHL, but those behind the Iron Curtain were restricted from following suit. Borje Salming was the first European star in the NHL. He played his entire career with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Finnish stars Jari Kurri and Esa Tikkanen helped lead the Oilers dynasty of the 1980s. In 1980, Peter Stastny, his wife, and his brother Anton secretly fled Czechoslovakia with aid of Nordique's owner Marcel Abu. The Stastny's defection made international headlines and contributed to the first wave of European entrants into the NHL. Hoping they would one day be permitted to play in the NHL, teams drafted Soviet players in the 1980s, 27 in all of the 1988 draft. However, defection was the only way such players could play in the NHL. Alexander Mogilny, one of those Soviet players taken in the 1988 draft, became the first NHL draftee to defect from the Soviet Union to play in North America. Shortly before the end of the 1988-89 regular season, Flames general manager Cliff Fletcher announced that he had reached an agreement with Soviet authorities that allowed Sergei Parakin to play in North America. It was the first time a member of the Soviet national team was permitted to leave the Soviet Union. Shortly after, Soviet players began to flood into the NHL. Teams anticipated there would be an influx of Soviet players in the 1990s, as 18 Soviet players were selected in the 1989 entry draft. Some of those Soviet players taken in the 1989 NHL draft include Sergei Fedorov, Pavel Bure, Vladimir Konstantinov, Artur Urbe, and Vladimir Malakov. The NHL experienced another golden era during the Gretzky years, but they failed to capitalize on his popularity until he was towards the end of his prime when he got to LA. During the 1980s, the NBA was revived thanks to the rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, and then Michael Jordan made the game global. Unlike the NBA, the NHL did not see the value of having TV broadcasts in the US until 1993, which means the US audience missed out on Wayne Gretzky's prime. If the NHL had done a better job of marketing their stars in the 80s and 90s, perhaps the NHL would be a lot more popular now. From the dynasties of the 1980s, the NHL moved into another era of expansions and relocations in the 1990s, which grew the game exponentially.